Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation John, Dick, and I had about the basics of Formula One. We shared this conversation with our community last year and received a lot of great feedback. So we decided to rebroadcast it now for new listeners and those who might be new followers of Formula One. As before, our goal in this conversation is to make the sport approachable. If you're a veteran F1 fan, feel free to tell us what you believe we should have included. But before we get to the conversation, I need to take a moment to ask, have you subscribed to or followed the show on your favorite podcast app? Have you shared the show with your fellow F1 fans? If not, can you take a moment to do so now? For an indie podcast like us, that's how we grow. You taking these small actions, and we are growing because of you. The guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Gentlemen, we have had a number of new fans to F1, and this episode is really for them. I don't think that veterans will not like this, but I think that they may find this basic. But for our new people, they want to know a little bit of the history. They want to know a little bit of the nomenclature and to sit in a room with people talking and to feel like they belong. I think having a F1 101 conversation would be really good for them. So John, I'm going to start with you. What is the history of F1 and why is it even called Formula One?
Well, it's called Formula One because the cars, it's the top or the number one open wheel racing formula in the world. So it's called Formula One because that. Historically, the deep backstory on this is when car manufacturers began manufacturing cars, they did road tests to prove whose car was better. And these were done on open roads, and sooner or later, being men, they began to be races instead of just tests. And but actually in 1946 is when we really began Formula car racing as we know it today as Formula One.
Is there a reason why it's called Formula One?
Yeah, it's been called variously Formula Libre and other things like that. But the cars are built to a specification. So the rules, like the manufacturers, the organizers get together, they establish a set of rules, and that is the formula to which the cars have to be built. Each team in Formula One, contrary to a lot of different formula racing or open wheel racing, each manufacturer has to build his own car. Each team has to build his or her own car.
Okay, Dick, tell me, what is the championship all about?
So the championship is basically two championships that get contested every race weekend. One's for the drivers and one is for the teams. And, to the driver goes the glory, but for the teams, it's a massive contest or really struggle every year against their opposition because each team has two cars being fielded. And obviously, it's very important for the teams to score well because there's so much money at stake for the Constructors' Championship. The points are awarded both to the driver and to the team. So if you win the race, you get 25 points. If you finish 10th, you get 1 point. And then there's a distribution of points in between on a sliding scale. In the Constructors' Championship, much, much better to actually have both of your cars finishing as high as possible to score as many points as possible.
Okay, so to restate what you just said then, there is a driver's championship and a constructor's. Both are based off of how that car performs in the given races cumulatively. Is that correct?
Yeah, over the course of 22 races or however many we have this year.
And so for the constructor to win, they would ideally have both of their cars with both of their drivers scoring pretty high in every race. Okay, so Dick, tell me, John just mentioned there are other formulas. Help our listeners understand, what is the road to F1?
So if you're a driver and you aspire to make it to F1, you typically start as a very young kid in karting. There's been several drivers who have started at the age of 5. When they reach a certain level of proficiency, and by the time they've got to be at least 14 years old, they're actually ready to move into full-size cars. So typically the next step would be what's called Formula 4. And Formula 4 is basically a scaled down, less powerful version of a Formula 1 car. And if you do well and you win races, win championships, you'll probably, attract enough backing to move into Formula 3, which is just a bigger, faster car, but not quite as big and fast as a Formula One car. And then ultimately you step into Formula Two, which is, another big step in performance, getting you closer to experiencing the performance of an F1 car. So it's really training, not only learning how to drive, but also learning how to set a car up, how to work with engineers, how to work within a team, those kinds of things.
And it's as competitive as the F1 because the goal is to get to F1.
Really top guys, they are desperate to prove that they belong in Formula One.
John, let me ask you this. We use the word the grid. What exactly is the grid?
It's one of those terms that comes to use in sports where something practical just basically defines itself. When people line up for a race, they've qualified, and their qualifying position typically is laid out on a piece of paper, marking first and second in the first row, usually second, third and fourth in the second, and so forth and so on. And that basically is a grid of how they form up to start the race.
Okay, so is it then that the two drivers get to sit side by side?
It's based off of qualifying, and the drivers don't actually sit directly side by side. They generally line up a few meters back. So first has an advantage because they qualified first. Second, less of an advantage, but still an advantage over third. And they're equally spaced then all the way back through the rest of the grid.
Okay, so then it seems like this question might be obvious, but I want to still ask it. Is this an individual or a team sport?
Yes, you're right. It is both an individual and a team sport because each driver is driving for himself. They do have to mind the fact that they're driving for a team, but if they don't beat their teammate, they're second, and none of these drivers want to be second in anything. But it's a team sport because, as Dick was mentioning, the manufacturers championship is where the money is for the team. And so the team has a very, very keen interest in winning that championship. So the drivers end up, even though they may hate each other, they may be mates and get along fine, they're still combating against each other for position in the team, but they're also working together for the benefit of the team. It's a very challenging sort of environment sometimes when they get across purposes with each other.
I think that's a really good point to highlight, that they're working together, but also not. They want to be number one. What is a team in the context of Formula One?
Team is really exactly what it sounds like. If you think of a football team, we generally think of the players, but also the coach. And then you look at the other people on the field, the physios and the equipment support teams and the broadcast teams and all the people in the box calling plays. Formula One's very much the same way. There are drivers, there are team principals, the guys who are responsible for organizing the team and making sure the team has funding. There's mechanics, engineers, strategists, design people, the people that do the fulfillment for the sponsors to make sure they have plenty to eat and drink at their hospitality tent. So it is a large, in Formula One, a large group of people, hundreds of people sometimes.
So it's not necessarily, even when we think about team, just the people, like what we see in front of us on the TV screens. There are hundreds of people behind the scenes that are making each race work for that given constructor.
Right. There are, in fact, people back at the factory during the race weekend working on computers, working on additional parts, making sure that they have what they need. If they have a big crash, they can overnight things to the track. So there's a lot of people involved.
I think that's good for a newbie to hear, that when at the end of the race, the driver says thank you to the team, he's not necessarily meaning just to the people that we've been watching on the screen, but the hundreds of people that have made the actual car work for that day along. He just has the privilege of driving, but there's so many people that have enabled that car to be on that track at that moment and to move on to the next one. Okay, so what about the tiers? There are tiers that we look at. We call them top teams. Sometimes you hear the term midfield. Sometimes you hear the back markers, or I sometimes call them backbenchers. Who are the top, mid, and back markers?
Well, currently, arguably, you have Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes as the top teams, although this year Aston Martin, which has been considered a midfield team, is pulling itself up, and even Alpine is now moving towards the front of the grid. But basically, you kind of divide it into thirds, and the top third are those who can actually win races any weekend. The midfield are those who could win a race eventually, or perhaps if they're lucky. That would include not just Aston and Alpine, but McLaren and Alfa Romeo, as well as AlphaTauri, the sister team to Red Bull. And then the back markers, or the back of the field, unfortunately includes our American team and the team with an American American driver, both Haas and Williams currently. Kind of rotate through these positions. 10 years ago, Williams was one of the top teams. Now they're at the very back. So it's not a permanent position and there's nothing established, although the top manufacturers, Ferrari and Mercedes, tend to stay right at the front. Mm-hmm. They have to, or they can't be involved. Corporate image that they're projecting.
Well, and I think one of our future episodes that we are planning to have available to our audience will highlight just some of the challenges that teams have of financing and building the cost that results from running a team. And I think that'll help in elaborating on this. That leads us to a question about history. And you know how much I love history. I want to be very careful that we're staying at that 30,000 foot level of looking at the history of Formula One. What are the regulations and how does the changing of regulations produce eras within F1?
So the teams are organized according to the regulations, and the regulations change over time as they either develop new things or new technologies become available, new manufacturing techniques and that sort of thing. So in the beginning, racing cars was just something that really wealthy people did, and they got together and raced those things. After the war in 1947 was when they started racing again after fighting the war. They got really more formal about it, and that's when you really began Formula One as a specific defined racing series. The cars were kind of funky by today's standards. They were front-engined cars. They were not particularly safe, nor were they particularly easy to drive, and you had folks come in like Fangio, who was a 5-time world champion. You had then the period of normally aspirated engines, which are engines that most of us would have in our cars most of the time when we had carburetors and now fuel injected. But those engines just take in the air from the atmosphere. It's not forced in or pressurized in any way. It's just naturally aspirated. Then you went into the late 50s, and a guy named John Cooper had an idea, and he put the engine, instead of being in the front, they were worried about weight distribution. So he moved the engine to the middle of the car and put the transmission behind it, the driver in front of the engine. And that just opened up a whole new world because the engineers got to change things and the drivers got to change things and the cars handled a whole lot better. In the 60s, that continued to develop. You then got the V8 engine, and Ford came into the sport about that time. And when they came in, it really changed everything for the next decade or two, because Ford essentially established a manufacturing facility with Cosworth, and that engine, anybody could go buy a Ford Cosworth DFV engine and stick it in their race car that they designed in their garage, really, and could go racing. And that was the beginning of a new era. Then you had in the 70s technology. That's when we really began to get technology, and Formula One began to be less of a elite sport in the sense that only a few people were aware of it. More people began to be aware of it. It began to be televised, at least in Europe, and rarely and on occasion in the US. But when that started happening, well, then not only did the technology drive the cars forward and make them interesting, but the drivers became rock stars. And they were sexy, they were playboys, they lived gregarious lives and were very much envied by many young men, including myself when I was at that age. But they moved on then, and the costs began to escalate. And when the cost escalated through things that they developed, like turbocharged engines, well, when they came in with turbocharged engines, they produced the same size engine would produce 150% or more of horsepower as the naturally aspirated engines. It got real expensive, and they got into a race about that, and things began to escalate. So they figured, well, we need to slow this down. About this time, a guy named Bernie Ecclestone got involved, and he began trying to figure out a way to afford to run his racing team, which was called Brabham. And he began to organize the sport around commercial success. And he started selling sponsorship and organizing the organization of Formula One into a group so that they would have leverage to be able to go to the track owners and promoters to get a better deal financially. And that changed things, brought in more money, which led to more development. And you eventually get to the place where we changed things back. Turbocharging was there. You got into the 70s, sort of, you ended up with the fuel embargo. So Formula One then, over the next decade or two, began to be fuel conscious. So you got into, instead of being able to run as much fuel as you wanted to, they had pit fires that burned people, and that was not very good for television or for the sponsors. So they started safety, fuel mileage, less fuel in the car. And eventually we get to the place where safety really does drive things. And we come to the halo concept, which everybody sees, the funny little thing up in front of the driver and above his head that's called a halo. And that was a safety feature that got in place, sadly, after one of the drivers was killed when his head was impacted.
So are there any names that as a new fan, they should be aware of? I asked that question knowing that one name that I would make sure if you are a new fan to go read and watch about is Senna. And we've mentioned him on many of our episodes, but are there any others, John?
Oh, there are many notable names through the sport, and some of the more prominent ones, there have been movies made about Niki Lauda and James Hunt. So that's something that our fans should look into. In the era of Ayrton Senna, there was Nigel Mansell and Alain Prost, who was a big rival of Ayrton Senna. He was a very impressive driver as well as Mansell. Beyond that, you had Michael Schumacher. There were several others who were really competitive with him. Jenson Button, I think, was another one who was noteworthy. But those are names that all of our fans should really become aware of if they want to know more about drivers whose personalities and achievements have been writ large in the sport.
This is good. I think you did a great job with a very challenging thing of condensing that much history into a handful of minutes. Dick, we're going to have almost just as a complicated request, which is what about the technology side of F1 cars should they know about? There are a lot of terms. So what is the engine, the power unit that we sometimes also call it?
These days, you have engines that are hybrids. You've got the ICU or internal combustion unit, and then you have attached to that the hybrid unit itself that basically takes energy that would otherwise be wasted and converts that into electricity, where then a battery, at the various simplest terms, is recharged by the hybrid unit, is then activated to provide additional power to the wheels via electric motors. Very, very complicated, very expensive technology. They produce it, in a number of ways from the standpoint of the hybrid power. The engines themselves, the ICU, the internal combustion unit, it's 1.6 liters, 6 cylinders. You have to have only one turbocharger. After that, then there's freedom around how do you capture the extra energy off of the exhaust gases and braking forces and all that. Which is way beyond my understanding, but there's different ways of going about doing that. And that's where the teams begin differentiating themselves between the various engines.
When we hear the term formula that John had said at the early part of this conversation, that's where the formulas and the regulation changes, all of that are affecting the engine and the power unit, right? For each era?
Sure. The engine, the power unit, the chassis, the aerodynamics, all of that make up the formula. The engine's going to be a big part of it because no engine, no go. You got to have it.
You used a word that I was going to ask you to define. What is the chassis?
So the chassis is basically these days a carbon fiber, think of a bathtub almost, except that instead of being open at the top, it is just has an opening big enough for a driver to slide into. Basically where the steering wheel is forward to the driver's feet is all enclosed. But I mean, it literally is called a tub. And off of that is then hung the suspension, the bodywork, the engines are mounted. Within the tub, there is a compartment that fits behind the driver's back, but in front of the engine, and that is where the fuel is held. There's a fuel cell that is a rubberized cell, basically, that then fits inside this very highly protected area, because obviously what you don't want to have is a crash and have that fuel cell punctured, because leaking gasoline on a hot engine results in a fire. That is to be avoided at all costs. So the chassis does a lot of different things, up to and including protecting the driver in case of an accident.
How does that integration happen between the engine, power unit, and then the chassis?
Great question. Really, you kind of have to think about it as the tub, the engine and power unit, and then the transmission or gearbox, as it's also known. And basically what happens is the engine is mated up to the gearbox, which then mates up to the chassis or the tub. But what's interesting is that the engine and the gearbox are what are called stressed members. In other words, they actually, when they get bolted up together and then attached to the chassis itself, they all become a part of the chassis. So the engine and the transmission are actually doing double duty. The engine's producing power, the transmission is delivering that power to the ground, but it is also the thing that, like, the rear suspension is mounted to. The body work attaches to the engine and the transmission. All those things go together to make a full unit. You'll notice that, like on the rear wing, that rear wing's got to attach to something. Well, it attaches to the very back of the transmission. So they all integrate together.
Okay. And then that comes from not only, I guess, the weight limits that they're under, but just also maximizing the dollars and making sure that also you're as efficient as possible.
Definitely want to do that because you want the stiffest chassis possible. You don't want it to be able to twist. Obviously, getting an engine to twist would be very difficult, right? So they're like the engine blocks, the casings of the transmissions, incredibly strong, very lightweight, but incredibly strong.
Are there any special electronics that are related to the car?
Yeah, there's all sorts of electronics that are involved. You have telemetry coming off the cars as they are on track. Obviously, the people back in the garage are looking at that telemetry coming off the engine and all these different data points, pressure sensors, that sort of thing, not only in the garage, but back at the factory, right? In case something were to go wrong with an engine or something, they can spot it. But then the driver has certain controls that he can be using to dial in perhaps more bias in the differential.
Let me interrupt you. When you say the bias in the differential, meaning the tires?
The differential that is basically putting the power into the tires. You think about a car going around a corner, the outside rear tire has to rotate faster than the inside rear tire. Otherwise, you would get horrible tire scrub from that inside tire. And so what a differential does, allows that outside tire to either speed up or slow down, depending on the characteristics of the corner. And so sometimes you'll see the driver sitting there going down a straightaway and he's fiddling with a dial on the steering wheel. And what he's doing is he's actually dialing in a different map on the differential because there's a completely different style of corner coming up. And so he needs a different handling characteristic. He can also dial in the mapping on the engine. So, maybe he's doing really well conserving fuel and now it's time to go. So you dial in the ability to burn more fuel. Well, more fuel, more bang, more power, one of those kind of deals. So there's all sorts of things at the driver's disposal that he can be adjusting that's, relatively new to the sport. Certainly back in the 70s and 80s, you really didn't have much of that.
Here's what I want to make sure is clear to people. These decisions that you're talking about are happening in seconds while the guy is driving super fast and he's that in tune with his vehicle that he understands, or he knows the track so well that he knows those type of differentials. I'm assuming that's also part, for those who haven't listened to the onboard with the driver, that's also part of the engineering and strategy team's reminders if needed, right? To help the driver to really push the car through all this technology to the maximum level and efficiency and effectiveness, and also keeping all the strategy at play during the race. We hear the term aerodynamics.
Yep.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Today's cars have what are called ground effects. And basically running down each side of the car is a tunnel that if you were to go and look at it, if you could see a cross section of it, that tunnel is actually shaped like an upside down airplane wing. And so what it does is that the faster the car goes, it relies on something called Bernoulli's principle, which says that when a liquid or a gas speeds up, it actually exerts less pressure. And so the whole idea is to have a situation where you're able to go and have the airflow going underneath the car to actually create a vacuum, basically, that goes in underneath that car. And as it accelerates, as the air accelerates, it exerts less pressure. So the pressure then going over the top of the car shoves the car into the road. And so what you wind up getting is a car that maybe it weighs 1,500 pounds with the driver in it or thereabouts, but it's producing 4,000 or 5,000 pounds of downforce at a certain speed. The basic thing is that these cars produce so much downforce through their aerodynamics that you could actually go and just drive them upside down and the car wouldn't really know the difference.
Wow. What about fuel?
Yeah,
how do they affect the car?
Well, this is one of those deals where every team has their own philosophies about, fuel and lubes and all that sort of thing. It's dictated by the teams that actually manufacture the engines, right? So that's going to be, Renault through the Alpine and Mercedes with their various teams, Ferrari, and basically Honda, another one. That fuel, even though it is gasoline, it is a highly specialized gasoline that can deal with the immense combustion chamber pressures that they're getting off of these engines, because you have a 1.6 liter engine, single turbocharger, you got the hybridization. All those combined make 1,000 horsepower or thereabouts. So you're getting enormous amounts of power out of very, very small engines. To do that, you've got to have fuel that's, just the side of rocket fuel, I think.
Well, so the next question, John, is what is the cost cap and why does it exist?
Cost cap is just exactly what it sounds like. It's a cap on how much money a team can spend on certain things. And the reason it exists is so that the teams will at least have some level of parity. Unfortunately, some teams are much more effective, or for reasons such as Ferrari is a very attractive brand. Everybody wants to be associated with Ferrari so they can name their price. And a lot of money will go to a team like Ferrari, whereas a team like AlphaTauri, maybe, certainly Williams at this point, Haas, they don't have that kind of cachet, so they can't really leverage their brand for as much money. So in order to try and make it a leveler playing field and more fair, the sport put in a cost cap, and that cost cap has de-escalated over the last several years to $135 million. Now that sounds like a lot of money to most of us, but some of the teams were spending upwards of $1 billion in order to field their team and to all the associated activities. So the cost cap, while it is a limit, it's not exactly all that's spent, because there are certain things excluded from the cost cap, like marketing costs, fee for the driver or his salary, and the costs of the team's top 3 employees. So those things are exempted. Also exempted, it's not really exempted, but the cost of engines is capped at 15 million euros a year, about $20 million. And also the cost of flying, hotels and meals and that sort of thing for the team don't count as well.
Dick, what do the flags in an F1 race mean? Like, I'll just run down through them. Green, what does that mean?
Green and flag, it means 2 things. One, it's the start of the race, but it also means that the track is clear and it is available for racing.
Yellow.
So that means that something has happened. There's a hazard on the track, somebody's crashed, or a part's fallen off the car. Maybe there was some incidental contact between 2 drivers, and some carbon fiber end plates are now laying in the middle of the track, and they constitute a hazard. So you may have what's called a local yellow, which means that you can't pass for a certain specific distance. Usually it's a corner or 2, or you could have a full course yellow, which would mean that you can't pass anywhere. But it all has to do with basically protecting the safety crews and whatever, if you have a stalled car on the track or whatever, is protecting all of that, as well as the drivers that are still racing, to keep everybody at a more safe and sane speed.
Red flag.
Yeah, so the session's just been suspended because whatever happened, the crash or whatever, has required so many safety vehicles, so much cleanup. They've just got to stop the race because it's just not safe for the cars to be on track, both for the cars and for the safety personnel.
Blue flag.
Blue flag is shown, like if you're getting lapped by the leaders, the blue flag will come out and will let you know, hey, a faster car is approaching. Be looking in your mirrors because they're coming through.
Okay, you used a lingo, being lapped. What does that mean?
It means you're going slow enough that the leaders have actually gone all the way around the track and are now passing you and putting you a lap down. So the leaders may have done 20 laps, but you've already done 19. Okay. Unfortunately, in my own racing, that is all too well known. We'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. White flag.
So it can mean a number of things, depending on the kind of circuit that you run. White flag can mean it's the last lap of the race, or it can also mean that you have a slow vehicle ahead. Usually it has to do with a safety vehicle. The white flag in the context of a safety vehicle is what is used in Formula One.
Checkered flag.
Yeah, checkered flag, everybody associates that with winning, but actually what it really means is it's the end of the session.
And you just said safety car. What exactly is a safety car? And how is that different from a virtual safety car?
So the safety car is a regular sports car. It's either produced by Aston Martin or Mercedes. It just depends on which race. But it's fully outfitted with all racing seats and racing suspension, and basically is a rapid response vehicle in case there's an accident. You'll notice the safety car on the first lap of any Grand Prix. The safety car comes behind the field, driving as hard as they can to stay somewhat close. In case there is an accident, they have a doctor in the car. The doctor can jump out out and administer first aid probably faster than anybody. But in the case of a full course yellow, you could put the safety car out and they'll be going around the track at a much slower rate of speed. And the race cars themselves have to be stacked up behind the safety car, who will then drive however many laps are needed to clear up whatever needed to be cleared up off the track. When the flashing yellow lights on the back of the car go out, then the drivers know that the safety car is about to pull into the pits and they're about to go racing again. Virtual safety car is basically a deal where you have a system of lights around the track and the drivers are expected, once again, they can't pass, but they're expected to also slow down to a certain percentage of what racing speeds would be. Again, this is to provide the opportunity for corner workers and that to remove any hazards that might be on the road.
So it's kind of like a scale. A virtual safety car versus a safety car really is telling you there's more time that's needed to deal with whatever has created that yellow. Okay. John, what is the racing calendar?
The racing calendar is effectively the racing season, and it covers from about March through October, and it takes place this year, 23 races, the most we've ever had. It happens in 20 different countries and is on 5 continents, so it's truly international. The tracks are everything from brand new tracks, Las Vegas this year will be brand new, to tracks that are historical homes for Formula One races, such as Monaco and Silverstone in England and that sort of thing.
Dick, what is the Grand Prix weekend schedule?
So normally it would be 2 free practice sessions on Friday that are timed. They're an hour long each with about a 2-hour break in between. And then on Saturday, there would be what they call FP3 or free practice 3, which is then followed by qualifying, which is a knockout format where they have all the cars go out in the first qualifying session. The fastest 15 cars then graduate to the second qualifying session, and the fastest 10 cars in the second qualifying session then graduate into what's called Q3, which is where they'll battle out for the top 10 grid spots. Now, on weekends when they have a sprint race, that changes up a little bit, because on Friday, you'll have free practice 1, and then you'll have qualifying for Sunday's race. So you only get one session to actually get your car set up to go out and actually run in qualifying. And then on Saturday, you'll have a free practice followed by the sprint race. And then on Sunday, you'll have the Grand Prix, which would be the same, in either of those scenarios.
So the sprint doesn't happen every weekend. It only happens on certain weekends. And which ones?
They are specially designated for sprint races. For example, this weekend, from the time that we're doing this recording, end of June, we'll be doing a sprint race in Austria. We'll have another one in Belgium. We'll have one at Circuit of the Americas. And then lastly, in Brazil at the Interlagos Circuit.
John, what is the Grand Prix race and what are the race guidelines?
Grand Prix races are either a distance, which is 305 kilometers based on the track's length. The different tracks have different lengths, so you don't have a lap limit, so to speak. There's not 100 laps at each race or 500 miles, but 305 kilometers is the standard race distance. However, there is also a 2-hour time limit. So that's in place in case there are things like rain or other conditions. Accidents can stop the race and it's still going to go only 2 hours. So there's a 2-hour time limit or a 305 kilometer distance. Usually the race happens, as Dick mentioned, qualifying is on Saturday and the races are on Sundays unless it's a night race.
How are the cars positioned for the start of the race?
So they're lined up according to qualifying position on the grid, which is typically a line painted across the track. That's a very serious piece of real estate. If the driver goes a centimeter past the white stripe it's called a box, basically. If he is outside that box, either to the left or the right, he's deemed out of position and he gets penalized for that. If he's over the line for his grid box, he's out of position. So they line up in a staggered way according to their qualifying position for the start of the race.
So how does the race actually start then?
Nowadays, it started with a light system, and there's a big series of lights across the front of the track, in front of them, past the start-finish line, that they can see. It's up high, so all the drivers can see it from their car, and each in sequence, one of 5 lights lights comes on until all 5 lights are lit. And that can be held for as long as the starter wants to. And as soon as those lights all go out, then the race starts.
So wait, that's kind of cool. I didn't know that there isn't a set time of waiting. Like it's all based off of someone deciding to turn the lights out.
Yeah, the lights are fairly predictable. They go on at a certain sequence, but the starter determines when the race actually starts, and he then has the lights turned out.
Oh, and you said that hasn't always been the case?
No, in early days, they used a flagman, and he would stand up there and wave a green flag, and that would start the race. Formula One races always start from a standing start.
That's really cool history there. Dick, tell me, what about the race itself? What should a person need to know if they're trying to just understand what they're going to see over those either 2 hours or those X amount of laps that are trying to get 305 kilometers?
There's a number of factors that come into place, and one, of course, is that the cars now in race trim are full of fuel. They're not light like you would have for qualifying. And so whatever you see for the qualifying times, you'll notice that the race times suddenly are 3 to 4 seconds slower than they qualified at, usually anyway. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, the cars are full of fuel, like we just said. But the other part is that they've got to maintain their tires. And by that, I mean, if you push really hard, you can have the tires start to degrade. And we can talk about that later. But when they start degrading, they start losing grip. And when you start losing grip, then the car starts sliding around all over the place and you go slower. So there's this strategy that's being employed by the teams of what tire should we use, when should we use it, how hard should we let our driver push, that sort of thing. And of course, the drivers, they want to go as hard as they can all the time. That's not necessarily the fastest way cumulatively over the course of a race. And so then on top of that, there's the strategy of, well, when do we bring a driver in to change his tires? Do we do just one pit stop? Do we do 2 pit stops? What do we need to get there? And then if it decides to rain, then that becomes a whole different deal. Do we put on intermediate tires because it's not raining all that hard? Or do we go full wet because it's really raining hard? There's lots of puddles and we need all the grip we can in the wet circumstances. So there's all sorts of strategy that's going on. And oh, by the way, while they're doing all this, the drivers are sitting there racing against each other, trying to pass each other or defend against the pass. There's this thing called the DRS, which is called the drag reduction system. And basically what that does is that it flattens out the top element of the rear wing and reduces drag very significantly to allow a car that is within a second of the car in front of it to flatten out that rear wing and go much faster in a straight line to aid then in making a pass down a long straightaway. So there's certain designated areas where you can open that DRS system up. And so the drivers, the moment they get into that DRS zone, as they call it, they pop open the rear wing and flying down the straightaway.
So how is that related to slipstream?
Slipstream is basically where the car in front of another car is basically punching a hole in the air and it's creating a vacuum behind it. And so if a car that's following behind this vacuum gets close enough, they're actually running in dead air. It works a lot better on series where they don't have the issues of turbulence that are being created by the front and rear wings. So think NASCAR, think sports cars. The slipstream is a whole lot better. If you think about it, if you have wings and they need air to create downforce, and now you're riding in the slipstream of another car, and it's essentially a vacuum, you suddenly don't have air going over those wings. So guess what? You can't corner as fast. So it's a real fine line.
John, Dick mentioned pit stops. What exactly is a pit stop?
The pits are where the teams are waiting for the driver to service the car. And pit stops are a time during the race when they come in to either change tires or in other iterations of the racing Formula One, they have refuel during pit stops. But they're strategic now from the standpoint of tire changes. And they're also used as a strategy piece to position the car if, for instance, a driver is having a hard time getting past a group of drivers, then he can pit and and that puts him out on a different strategy than those other drivers and allows him perhaps to have a track free of traffic so that he can go faster and hopefully overtake those cars that he couldn't get past when they pit.
Dick, what about these tires? Why is tire strategy important?
Well, John was kind of alluding to it. And basically what you have to understand is that Pirelli makes 5 different tires of different compounds that are for the dry. They also make a wet tire. They also make an intermediate tire. And we kind of talked about those already. Those 5 compounds, Pirelli makes an educated guess of which one that they're going to take. And the compounds go from quite soft to relatively hard. And the idea is that the harder tire is not as fast, but it's way more durable. And so sometimes you might run a harder compound tire to eliminate a pit stop, because pit stops, you have to slow down, come off the track, slow down, drive down pit road, get the tires changed out, then drive all the way to the end of pit road and speed back up. So you could lose 20 or 30 seconds to your opposition by making a pit stop. And so the gamble that you have to make is that those new tires are going to make me faster than the guys on the old tires. And the old tires have what they call a deg or degradation. And basically what happens is that as those tires go through their life on the track, the compound basically loses stickiness. I guess that's the best way to put it. The grip that the tire produces becomes less and less with the more laps that you put on it. Some of that rubber is laid into the track, and that causes the track to do what they call evolve, which is to provide actually more grip from the track itself, which is a good thing. But many times pieces of rubber just come off the car and get flung to the outside of the corner. And you can see that. They call it clag, but you see all these little bits and pieces of rubber just littering the outside of the track. And if you get off into that stuff with the hot, sticky tires, it takes quite a while to clean that stuff off, and it makes the car become very slippery. But anyway, the point of it all is that you may start a race knowing that you're heavy on fuel. You may start the race on a medium compound tire, knowing that extra weight in the car is going to work the tire a lot harder than it would if the fuel tank was, half full or something like that. And you might come in then after a number of laps, pit and put on a set of softer tires when the car is lighter, so that you can go on what should be a faster tire because it's softer and therefore stickier and gives you more grip. And then you go back out on track and you should be able to lap quicker, as John was saying, than somebody that's got a whole set of tires. And so lots of strategy, lots of work by the race strategists and the engineers to figure out, okay, which pit stop strategy do we want to fall under? Which tires do we start on? Which tires do we finish on? And then they have to react to what the other teams are doing as well. And sometimes they have to cover their bets. One car may start on medium compound tires, but their other car may start on hard compound tires because they're not really sure what the track is going to do. And so they're hedging their bets by having both cars on somewhat different strategies. It becomes really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the part when we watch it, you're excited to hear the terms box come in. And when you hear weather's on the horizon, all of that can affect what you both have just shared when it comes to pit stop, tire strategies. What about the drivers for 2023? Who are they specifically, John?
Well, I'll cover this in 3 different sort of breakdowns of it. First of all, there were 3 drivers who changed teams in between seasons. So Fernando Alonso went from Alpine to Aston Martin. That left a gap at Alpine, so Pierre Gasly moved from AlphaTauri to Alpine. And then Nico Hülkenberg, who has been a driver but hasn't been driving in Formula One, came back from hiatus and joined the Haas team, replacing Mick Schumacher. So he wasn't a new driver, but he was a returning driver. And an interesting, sort of the facade there is that he and Kevin Magnussen, his teammate at Haas, have some pretty famous disagreements in the past, one in particular that people should Google and look up for their own interest. But the other section, or the second section I'd cover, are rookies. Yeah, what happened.
Yeah, I was just thinking you were being very polite about that.
I'm trying, but it is interesting, and I would recommend people look at it on their own. Then we have 3 new guys who've moved into the sport. Oscar Piastri, who's from Australia, has come in. Nick de Vries has come in from the Netherlands. making a second Dutch driver. And then famously for us, Logan Sargent has come in as the only American since 2006 or something like that, when Scott Speed was racing. So those are the rookies. The thing about Formula One is, yeah, it's an individual sport and a team sport, but the only way you can tell the driver when he's in the car is from his helmet design. People just have to educate themselves on who is who in the team, because the cars certainly look alike. But I'll just run through the teams and the drivers in the teams, and maybe a little bit of a comment or analysis on those guys. So first of all, you'd start with Red Bull, and their lead driver is Max Verstappen, who's leading the championship, has won world championship before twice, and looks to be unchallenged thus far for winning the championship. He's got a huge lead already. His teammate is actually hired to support him. He doesn't think so, but that's his job. His job is to help Max win races and to help the team win the manufacturer's championship. So he's supposed to qualify as good as he can, race as good as he can. If he beats Max, that's fine, but mostly he needs to finish second, third, fourth, somewhere in there, so that the team takes on the most points and wins the championship. You have a similar situation at Ferrari, where Charles Leclerc is essentially the number one driver, and Carlos Sainz is his supporting driver. Although it's really interesting because those two are pretty evenly matched. Ferrari formally doesn't have a number one status, so they're allowed to race each other. They both do a pretty good job of that. For the most part, they're very equal. Then you go to Mercedes, and Mercedes has Lewis Hamilton, who's a multiple world champion, and a new fellow at Mercedes, who's George Russell. And George raced for another team when Lewis was sick last year, and he actually impressed very, very well in the car. So he's the future of Mercedes, and Lewis is very much the present and past of Mercedes. So that's an interesting sort of generational change that will go on in that team over the next few years. Alpine then is Esteban Ocon, and we talked about Pierre Gasly. These two also have sort of a history together, not particularly friendly, but they seem to be working together and playing pretty nicely as adults to help Alpine, which has been in a real spot of trouble because the team is a manufacturer's team, Renault, and Renault is spending a lot of money for the team, and they're not getting the results. And they've kind of had a come to Jesus talk from the CEO right in front of everybody, criticizing the team principal, and it's just an uncomfortable situation. I'm glad I'm not there for that one. McLaren then is the next team. Lando Norris, a Brit who's done quite well, and I rate him fairly highly. I think he's going to be a real star if he gets in the right car at some point. And Oscar Piastri, the Australian rookie, who's doing a very good job. Aston Martin then, Fernando Alonso. This team is owned by Lawrence Stroll, and the second driver in the team is Lance Stroll, Lawrence's son. So it's kind of a billionaire project for his son, but Lawrence is a serious businessman, and he's put serious money behind this team. Seb Vettel drove for the team last year and the year before, put a lot of time and effort into the development of this car, and Fernando is really getting the most out of it. Lance is doing a good job, but is not quite up to the same level as Fernando. So, but I think Aston, if they continue what they've been doing this year, they're going to move up to the top four and be challenging Ferrari and Mercedes at least. They're already beating them in some respect. Then you go to Alfa Romeo with Valtteri Bottas, who used to be Lewis's teammate, his teammate, Guangzhou. He's doing a pretty good job, I'd have to say, after a couple of years in the sport, and is being reasonably good representative, a teammate for Valtteri. AlphaTauri is the second team it's the only team in Formula One, the only group in Formula One that owns two teams. Red Bull owns both Red Bull and AlphaTauri. So AlphaTauri becomes sort of a development team for their driver development program. And that's where you get Yuki Tsunoda and Nick De Vries in there. Haas then, Kevin Magnussen, Nico Hulkenberg, and these guys are running towards the back of the grid. The car just doesn't have the design that it needs to be competitive, nor does the Williams at present, with Alex Albon and finally with Logan Sargent. There is some hope for Williams. I think they've recently signed James Voles, who's the team principal now, and he's beginning to make his presence known and is going to be, over the next 2 years or 3, making significant changes there that should see Williams, if they're going to be able to kind of reclaim their former glory, it probably will be because of Val's presence and efforts in the team.
Just a quick follow-up. Alpine, they're an all-French team.
Yeah, they are now. Alpine being a Renault performance brand, and then both of their drivers are from France, Ocon and Gasly, which is an interesting sort of national situation. It has occurred in the past. It doesn't occur too often unless it's a British team, because most of the Formula One teams are based in England, and therefore occasionally you'll have two British drivers in the same team. But most of the time, you only have you don't have two drivers of the same nationality in a team of that same nationality.
Okay, earlier you referenced Haas as an American team. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, I will be glad to do that. Haas has been in Formula One for maybe going on 10 years now, something like that. Haas is a famous racing name because of the Newman Haas racing team in the United States. Gene Haas, the head of the company that manufactures CDC machines, computer design and computer driven manufacturing machines, he sells those machines, and he basically uses Formula One as a demonstration platform for his machines and to build the market in Europe for his machines. And so he does want to win. He's a winning kind of guy. You don't get in Formula One to be a loser. The team is a sister team of Ferrari. It came in very uniquely as a team that would buy their parts, as many as the sport would allow them, from Ferrari directly instead of manufacturing every single component. So they're a little bit unique in that regard, and they're a marketing tool for Gene Haas business principally, and then a racing team, in my opinion, second.
Okay, that's great. Dick, why don't you take us home? I got 4 questions. I'm going to do rapid fire.
Okay.
How does the race end? Like specifically what happens? How are points allocated? Who gets the prize money? And what happens at the end of the year championship?
Sure. So race ends. Obviously, the checkered flag falls on the car who covers the race distance in the fastest amount of time. And once the checkered flag falls, then everybody receives the checkered flag as they cross the start-finish line. The top 3 drivers then will go onto the victory podium to receive their trophies for the race. There will also be a representative from the team that produced the winning car, the first place car. Could be an engineer, could be a strategist, could be a mechanic, but they will also receive the constructor's trophy for that particular race. So that's kind of how it happens. The trophies are usually handed out by dignitaries from the country that is being represented. For example, for Monaco, you're going to have somebody from the royal family of Monaco presenting the trophies, that kind of thing. The points are allocated. We kind of talked about that before. First place for both the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship pays 25 points. Then there's a sliding scale so that when you get to 10th place, that only awards 1 point. Those points are totaled up at the end of the year, and that is what establishes where you finish as a driver in the Drivers' Championship or where the constructors finish in the Constructors' Championship. The prize money is distributed primarily after the season is over with, because the big chunk of the money that does get distributed is off of the various TV rights and other commercial rights that are then distributed among the Formula One teams based on where you finish in the championship. Prize money for the drivers, that oftentimes depends on where somebody's contract lands. Most of these guys will have some sort of a bonus structure put in based on, hey, you get a race win, you get X number of dollars, or you win a world championship, you get X number of dollars, those kinds of things. The prize money, though, for the most part, unless there's something in the contract that reads otherwise, that typically goes to the team, and then the team allocates it to their drivers based on whatever the contract says. And then at the end of the year championship, everybody gets together. It's usually in Paris. The world champion gets, his world champion trophy, and the team principal usually will receive the trophy for the team that won the constructors championship. By that time, new cars are already well underway in construction back at the factory, and it won't be too long before they get ready to start it all over again.
That's great. Let me do one follow-up. Fastest lap, does that get any kind of points?
Yes. Yeah, 1 point for fastest lap. Oftentimes you'll see a driver get pitted. They know that they can't win. They know that they can come in. They're far enough ahead of whoever's behind them. And it's right towards the end of the race, so the car is light on fuel and all that. It's almost like a qualifying sim. So they'll come in. The team will throw on a set of the softest tires available for that particular race. and tell the driver to just go for it. And so he'll go out and, do his best to crank out the fastest lap in the race and collect that extra point.
John, I got a question I think we should have asked earlier, but I think it's good to ask now, which is, what is Parc Fermé?
It is a area that's designated for the teams. In some cases, all of the cars, but at the end of the race, at least the top 3 cars and the others are in a different area sometimes. But it's an area where when they're in Parc Fermé, it means that there can be no changes made to the car. Nobody can touch the car. It has to be left in a specific condition. The steering wheel has to be put back on the car. Everything has to be left in a one condition and not touched and not changed. The reason for that is when they finish the race, they go through a technical inspection or a technical inspection period where a team may protest or where the winning team might be found to be underweight or in some other way in violation of the rules. And so that's a way to assure that the cars are left in the condition they were raced in or qualified in until the period of time is over. So that would be a time period, usually 30 minutes, or until the conflict that's raised is resolved.
Okay, gentlemen, I think that has exhausted my questions that I hope will help any of our new fans of F1, that the next time they listen to a race, that they will feel better equipped to be in that room or be watching that TV and understand some of the terminology, to understand some of the history because of what we've been able to share with them today. Excellent job, and I look forward to our next conversation. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.